Welcome back to episode 8 of the Can I Tell You Something podcast. We have a great episode in store where we will talk about the games from the New York Times.
Yes, and if you are not at all familiar, we will be going over Worldle, spelling bee, and I believe some crossword stories for you all.
And what's really exciting about this is we get to introduce you all to a part of our lives, which is every night at dinner when it's the two of us, we go through a routine of playing the various New York Times games.
We do. We bring out the iPad and we go to town. And I think it's kind of funny because a lot of people will wake up and first thing in the morning, they'll play those games, but we wait until night because, I don't know, we're just a little crazy with it.
And so it's kind of a part of our routine now. And when we go out to eat sometimes, we will pull out our phone. And it's funny because there's the whole perception of when you're on your phone, you're not with the other person. But this is how we bond. This is how we do our thing together.
It's our activities together. So we will be going into some stories behind these games, kind of where they came from and their significance now. And then we do have a little investigation, some detective work for you all.
Our first official investigation.
Yes. So we will be ending with that and get into that a little bit later. But for now, I think we will start with getting into some brief history of the games.
Yes. So I love bringing a prop on set for all of our episodes. And so my prop today, I guess this is a bit now, my prop today is a newspaper. It is the Sunday Seattle Times newspaper.
Your trinket of the day.
We're recording on a Sunday, which makes it really fitting for this theme because the Sunday crossword is one of the most classic puzzle games in newspaper history. So here I have the Seattle Times, and in here, in one of the sections of the newspaper, they publish two crosswords. They publish the New York Times crossword from Sunday and the LA Times crossword from Sunday.
So the Seattle Times doesn't have its own crossword.
No.
They're contracting it out from others. I didn't know that other newspapers had the New York Times crossword. I would have assumed that you could only get that from the New York Times. I feel like that's a little hack.
It is a little hack. I don't know whether or not the Seattle Times has a crossword of their own because I know that people love puzzling around these parts. So it wouldn't surprise me if they have a great puzzler.
But if they did, it would 100% be in the Sunday paper. So I'm going to assume that they don't.
And so if you can hear by the sounds of this paper, if you are only listening, I do have one section of the Seattle Times in my hand. And it has the crosswords and it has my show notes too. I scribbled them across the margins because I felt like it would be the most appropriate way to get through this episode is to have a paper. But I learned while doing research about this subject as a whole that the New York Times crossword is actually published in 300 different papers.
Whoa. I thought that she would have been an exclusive content, but wow, she's really branching out, it seems.
Yeah. So 300, I couldn't even name 50 different newspapers, let alone 300.
Couldn't even name 5.
We would really have to get to work on that to name them. But I will go through a brief history just for a high-level overview for those listening, because I know I sometimes get lost in podcasts, and I'm wondering, where are we with this story? So we're going to start at the beginning of these newspaper games and puzzles. We're going to work through the history all the way to how Worldle showed up in the New York Times games space. And then we're going to actually work back to spelling bee, which came before Worldle. So a brief history about the New York Times crossword. It was first published in the Times on February 15th of 1942. And it was featured daily in a 15 by 15 form. And then the Sunday version is 21 by 21. So that's why the Sunday
one's the big boy.
The big kahuna.
Isn't the Sunday crossword the easiest one?
I think
like the majority of most people are doing it on that day and not on the other days of the week. Because I know we do the minis on just the app, and I feel like Sunday is the easiest. But then Saturday is the biggest.
Yeah. So
they've jumbled things up a bit, I think.
Yeah.
since its creation.
And that actually I'll bring that up when we get into how the New York Times turned to games on my phone. Because that is an interesting point about the difficulty between the different puzzles.
Mm-hmm. But for now, we're just in print.
Yeah. And I also found on the Wikipedia page going through the crossword history that at first crosswords were considered like non-academic. They were considered useless brain exercises. Because
like a waste of time.
Like a waste
almost.
of time. So
that would never stand today.
And it's really funny too, because one of the issues with crosswords today that big puzzlers always talk about is how it's kind of difficult to be able to approach something like the Sunday Times crossword and work through all of the clues and not feel entirely lost and actually
and
enjoy
not
it.
Feel a little dumb as well.
Exactly.
I know for us, and we only do the minis where there's only a couple questions, but we will get stumped, and then I just feel bad about myself for the rest of the night because I can't answer one question.
Either that or we curse the puzzler or the puzzle editor.
That is true. And I guess I want to ask people out there how they react when they don't know an answer to a clue. Like, do you go on the internet and find the answer, or do you say, oh, this editor doesn't know what they're doing?
I learned that with the spelling bee in particular, that it's a community tradition to bully the editor about what words are included and not included.
I bet that there's some bullying all throughout.
I think that
games.
The difficulty of a puzzle sometimes causes people to act not their best selves.
A little on the silly side.
A little on the silly side. So, yes, we have the New York Times crossword. It starts in 1942. And then I'm going to introduce you to actually not another New York Times game, but some other kind of puzzle called Jotto.
Jotto? How do you spell that?
Jotto. And that
like jotting down?
Yeah. And this might sound a little familiar, because Jotto is a 5-letter word game where you try and guess a mystery word and you denote whether or not you guess the right letter in the right place or if you guess the letter at all. And so that game was so popular that it actually had its first appearance on TV under the title Lingo in 1997. And for anyone that's been perusing the streaming services lately, if you've seen RuPaul and the word lingo and what you think is a Worldle knockoff, guess what? Worldle knocked off the first 2 games, and then the lingo reboot is because of Wordle's popularity.
I think that's interesting because if you've seen the lingo ads, they look so, I don't know, cheap and a little cheesy. And I feel like Worldle has a stronger academic cult behind it. And so to hear that lingo was actually the one who came first and Wordle's essentially ripping that off is a little funky to think about.
And I actually want to be careful about saying that Worldle ripped off lingo, because
we don't want to accuse.
We don't want to accuse because that was kind of besides the point with the creation of Worldle. And so I'm going to get into the creation of Worldle real quick.
Hi there. Are you interested in listening to a brand new podcast called Can I Tell You Something? No. Well, if you were, then I would check out the podcast on TikTok and Instagram. And if you want to listen to full-length episodes, I would go on to Spotify, maybe YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts.
Well, okay then, mister.
You're welcome.
What's your name? I didn't catch it.
Doesn't matter.
Oh.
Worldle was created by Josh Wardle, and he created it for his wife because she loves word games and puzzles. And the premise was simple. He wanted a game that could be played in the browser that was kind of fun but not life-encompassing, and really liked the idea of having a new puzzle every day. I mean, this is a guy that has worked as a software engineer, kind of done a lot of web development type stuff. So this was kind of you can create Worldle in an afternoon. And So the genius behind Wordle is not actually the gameplay itself, because it's like, hey, here's a puzzle game that's really fun and it exists. I'm just going to make it possible to play in the browser. What made Wordle really successful, though, was the fact that anyone could play it. Because when you think about Lingo as a game show, you're not actually playing it. You're watching people play it. You can kind of play in your own head, but you don't get the experience of guessing the words yourself.
Right.
And then the other genius bit was the social media sharing part of it, where after you finish your game, you can share how you did without spoiling the word with all the emoji squares. Have you seen that?
I haven't.
Okay. Well, it's wonderful. So once you finish a game of Wordle, at least when it was first kind of taking Twitter by storm, you could share your game with people. And what it would do is it would create a grid of emojis, which were white, yellow, and green. And it would correspond with all the letters and guesses that you had.
Oh.
So you could show people whether you had like a nail biter, had to guess it on the 6th word, or somehow you got 4 letters on the first word. All those different game experiences could be shared without spoiling the game for someone else. Because once you know the word, the game is...
It's over for the day.
It's over for the day. The other thing that made it really successful too was, and the creator talked about this a lot, was how every person playing it played it for a different reason. There was a very low barrier to entry, but also a very high level of analysis that people could do. So, I mean, I saw people in the computer science community trying to figure out what the best opening word was, like mathematically, statistically, what should you open with? And then people were like, actually, no, like what should your opening 2 words be? And so they went over analytical with it.
Do you know what the statistically, I don't know, correct opening word was?
So the most popular word that people will guess on an opening word when it's not random is adieu.
To get all the vowels.
To get all the vowels except for O. But the computer science community, that there were so many differing opinions because everyone wanted to approach the game with a different strategy. Some people said that your opening guess should try and eliminate as many words as possible. And some people were like, no, you should try and guess as many letters as possible. So, I mean, just a very simple game. You had all these people having entirely different experiences with how in-depth they wanted to get. But at the end of the day, if you kind of guess a silly word and you get it on the second try,
you feel pretty good about yourself.
You feel pretty good.
I'm trying to think about what our strategy is. And I don't think we really have one. Usually we start with like a word that we've been using. Like stink, I like to use a lot. I also like chair because it feels right. We
had a phase of when we first created the company for, can I tell you something? Rough Draft Media. We would guess rough or draft or media.
Because they were all 5 letters.
Yeah, and it was fun too because it reminded us of what we were doing with putting a lot of work in to make this whole show possible. But I think that our strategy, if I had to describe it to other people, we like to have a fun guess off the bat.
We try to keep it interesting, I think.
If we don't get a single letter on the first guess, if anything, that gets me excited because I know it's about to be a bit of a juicy game. And
sorry, that was just kind of funny.
Yeah. Well, I think that for me, I get the most joy in the steps just before getting the right word. Like when you're close and you can kind of sense what it might be, and you're like, what if it's this word? And you press it and the tiles flip one by one and it's like green, green, green. And then sometimes it's just not green for the last one. You have to do another guess. But I think that that's what I get the most joy from when playing Worldle.
I just think it's fun. I wouldn't say that I'm chasing the adrenaline of each tile flip that you are, but I'm so happy that it makes you that happy.
Yeah.
And that's all.
But I think that that's the Wordle story, and like the New York Times game story is that people play it for different reasons.
I do know a lot of people that are extremely serious about it. and will wake up early, or it's like the first thing they do before they even check any messages or catch up on their day, they have to do Wordle.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a cultural phenomena.
Have you ever seen the TikTok lives of people just playing Wordle, like 400 games in a row?
I have not, but I think it's really funny how people have quickly found ways to play the game in mass with as many words as possible.
Because to me, that's just now Wordle is a game show on TikTok. Like, is that not just lingo, but for social media?
Yeah. I think of it from the human computer interaction perspective and like people being social online. I think that people playing Wordle together is like one of the most enjoyable thoughts when it comes to like what could happen on TikTok and especially TikTok lives. Like people playing Wordle is very wholesome to me.
Yeah, it's a nice break from what's usually on TikTok lives. So it's, I think, a good thing. And
for anyone that's scrolled through TikTok lives at 1 or 2 a.m.,
you know what we're talking about.
You know exactly what we're talking about. It's the Wild West.
It really is. So I have a question. Let's go back to the history of Wordle.
Yeah.
Specifically. You said it was founded by Mr. Wardle.
Josh Wardle.
Mr. Josh Wardle.
Yeah.
It sounds like he didn't work for the New York Times. Like this was its own game, essentially.
In fact, it actually was acquired by the New York Times. So the New York Times saw the success of this game and they're like, this is like a perfect game to add to our arsenal because, and I'll get into the spelling bee history, and that this is really where I think Wordle really translates nicely into the spelling bee story. But
and what year was Wordle released? Because I know, so Jada was 1955, the OG. Lingo 1997.
Yeah.
When was Wordle?
Wordle was first made public online October 2021. And then by December.
COVID. That's what I thought.
Yeah, it was a very COVID centric game. And that will actually be a reoccurring theme when we start talking about the Spelling Bee Forum, is that COVID really popularized those sorts of games. It gave a sense of community to people and a daily activity and ritual.
So I would have assumed that Wordle was created a lot earlier and then just gained popularity during COVID, but it wasn't, which means it would have had to take off almost instantly.
I think it did take off almost instantly. And a big part of it was, I mean, this is a person that has worked in the web design and like web building industry for a while. So naturally, I'm sure they knew a lot of people that were very excited about this sort of web-based concept and being able to play it themselves. And then they shared it with people, and then they shared it with people.
That was going to be my next question. Like, how did the word get out on Wordle?
Yeah, it was, I would have to chalk it up to probably word of mouth. There wasn't a big marketing campaign or anything. In fact, there was no marketing campaign. It was really just created because this guy wanted to make a game for his wife. And then he found that the game was really fun to play. And so he's like, well, might as well give it to the people. And I mean, it's still technically his game in terms of intellectual property rights. And that's actually what he sold to the New York Times, was like the ability to call it Wordle and have it within their game suite. And he actually was really happy about it being sold and being able to exit that project. Because,
yeah, why wouldn't you be?
Because for him, it was like, this is just something I made. I'm glad that people love it, but I don't want to be maintaining it every day. That's not what I'm most interested in. And so I like that bit of it too. And then the other really interesting bit about Wordle, because I'm sure that people out there listening to this know the feeling of, that's not a word, right?
Yes.
So if you go through whatever dictionary of your choosing, Merriam-Webster, Scrabble, Oxford, and you just look up every single 5-letter word there is, most people won't know most of them. Just because there are some random 5-letter words that are technically in the dictionary.
I'd like to put this to the test.
Okay.
Because I'd like to assume that I know a lot of 5-letter words.
And so I forget the exact numbers off the top of my head, but in developing this game, Josh Worldle had his wife work as the data tester for whether or not a 5-letter word was reasonable for people to know. It's like, do you know this word or not? Yes, no, yes, no. And so initially it was molded off of her vocabulary. And I, now that we've been talking about her so much, I wish I had her name off the top of my head. But if she wishes to remain anonymous, I think that that's perfectly okay.
We'll just refer to her as
Mrs. Worldle.
Mrs. Worldle.
But yeah, so there was a refined list of words. And in fact, in the early days of Worldle, I remember that people found that if you inspected the web page, which for people that don't know what that means, you can go to any website and you can kind of peer through the code that's creating the website itself in terms of what you see. And sometimes in that code, there are little bits that were left in by developers. And one of those bits, because this was a very, this was a game that was made for fun or for leisure, was the entire word list for every single word.
Do you know how big that list is?
I think it's about 3,000 words.
Okay. See, it doesn't feel like a lot, but then again, it does.
Yeah. But the word list was in there. And so people figured out what the next day's word would be because it just followed the order of the list. It wasn't randomized. It just went A, B, C, D. So once people found that pattern, they had to patch it up a little bit.
Just real quick, I've been looking into the 5-letter words. Mm-hmm. And I came across a webpage that says words added to the Scrabble dictionary. And I'd just like to share a few because for those out there who like Scrabble, this could really be helpful. Bae.
How do you spell that?
B-A-E, like you're my bae. Vax. It's in vaccine.
Oh, these aren't 5-letter words.
No, I just like, this is a little tangent I want to go off because I think it's juicy. Verbing, to use as a verb. Zonky.
Zonky.
Dumpster. Apparently that wasn't Scrabble legal until now.
Wow.
What are these?
Times are changing.
A bunch of these I can't even pronounce. Deep fake. All one word.
Yeah. So that was actually one of the... So let's get into the history of spelling bee because this is where we get into kind of what you're, digging
what
into
I'm getting
there.
at.
So spelling bee, I'm going to just preface this with, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, for newspapers, there was this big kind of like, oh shoot moment where things were switching digital very quickly and far faster than they were expecting. And so the New York Times almost went bankrupt during this period of time.
Haven't they almost gone bankrupt a good amount?
I want to say so.
Well, I'm glad they didn't.
Yeah. And for those of you wondering, I mean, the New York Times has been around since the mid 1800s. So them going bankrupt or them going out of business is a big deal. And I mean, they aren't a small newspaper, but yeah, a lot of smaller newspapers went out of business during that period of time when things were switching to blog style news websites. And so I watched this great documentary called Page One, goes through a lot of that. And one of the things that the New York Times was trying to do was to capture a digital audience, and they didn't quite know how. And one of the ways that they've figured out how to do that is through the games.
We are a New York Times subscribing household.
That we are.
But that does not necessarily mean that we are reading the newspaper. I think we'll read stories here and there. But for the most part, we're only in it for the games. That's it. No funny business. I want my spelling bee, I want my Worldle, my mini crosswords, now letterboxed, and I'm out. I'm done.
Exactly. We have our little routine. The games are everything to us.
So I think that's pretty common, at least in our age group.
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of our friends have a subscription too, and only they play the games.
And what was interesting is when I was looking up the history of spelling bee, part of the reason why it was first created was that the crossword part of the New York Times was too difficult for people to enter or to be able to pick up. And
That does make me feel better.
yeah, they found that it was too high skill of a game for people to casually enjoy. So they needed a game that appealed to a more casual audience, which is a bit funny considering how intense some people are about the spelling bee, but they needed a new game.
That's more, it's easier to be intense and a little crazy about a game that everyone can understand. Because even though the gameplay is harder, I think the stakes go up because the competitiveness goes up.
Yeah. If you can prove to yourself that you can spell a word, then you can play spelling bee. Like, that's the fun bit of it.
If you've ever taken a spelling test in your life against your will, you can play spelling bee.
If you've seen words and you like to make them out of letters, you can also play spelling bee. It's for everyone. So the spelling bee was introduced to the New York Times because they were looking for a game that appealed to a more casual audience. And actually, the spelling bee in its current form is an adaptation of a British newspaper game.
The British?
I forget what the game is off the top of my head, but it has a lot of very similar mechanics. However, in the British version, you can't repeat letters. So it has to be a string of non-double letter type things. So no T's in a row, no D's in a row, which for anyone that's played spelling bee, a lot of words, they have double letters in them. So
that would be very frustrating.
Right? So they wanted to take the general idea of that game and make it more appealing and accessible to their game community.
Take the worst version of the game, the British version, and make it better. The American version only applies to some things.
Only applies to some things.
For instance,
your mileage may vary.
The Office, spelling bee. Yeah, that might be just about it.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm going to have no opinions on this one, so I don't speak out of turn. But yeah, so the spelling bee was adapted from the UK newspapers, first published in 2014 in the New York Times in a print form, and actually was published in the New York Times Magazine. So it was like a magazine game.
Ooh.
Yeah. And so then 4 years later, on May 9th, 2018, it was adapted to a browser game, which is the form that it's in right now. And
I just wanted to clarify. I always thought browser game meant like a website.
It does mean a website. And this is where it gets a bit tricky because we play these games on our fun little app.
Yeah.
But the way that apps work on a phone, and I didn't know this until I started figuring out how apps worked, is a lot of them are adaptations of a website. They're built off of really, really similar code. And so it makes a lot of sense for websites to appear like apps or for apps to appear like websites.
That does make sense. I guess I'm just, sometimes I get confused with internet verbiage that I'm not up to date with.
Well, I mean, to be honest, there's no reason that people like of our generation should connect the two because the app store is different than your browser. So why would they be the same? But if you take, pull back the curtain, they're very, very similar. But so the spelling bee shows up in 2018. And then the spelling bee forum shows up 3 years later on July 26th, 2021. And this...
So there were, to clarify, there were 3 lonely years of spelling bee with no community forum.
Well, it would be actually wrong to say that there was no community forum because the community created their own forums and their own sort of pages.
Reddit
Reddit, Twitter was really popular for the spelling bee.
Right, but I mean within the app.
Within the app, there was nothing. It was just the game.
Which is crazy because I don't know if we preface this, but we were really late to the New York Times game craze. I think we only started playing these like 6 months ago, like religiously playing them.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting to hear how far they've come because we only know them as their like very up-to-date modern version. So I don't think I could. I think Spelling Bee would be very, very different without the community forum and the hints and everything like that.
Yeah.
So I'm happy that that's part of it now.
It's cool to see how much the game's actually evolved and also how long it takes for a game like that to evolve. I mean, 2014 from print to now, that's almost 10 years of this game, this silly little game. And yeah, so when the Spelling Bee forum was first created, I looked through the first forum post and they did a couple things. The first thing that they did is they published an article with a glossary of all the Spelling Bee little words that the community uses. Like QB means queen bee, which means you got every single word. And then there's like QBNH, which means queen bee, no hints. And like there's different sorts
like
of
your status among the community.
So
I wonder what we are. Because
we've never gotten queen bee.
no, we've gotten awesome.
We've gotten
amazing.
genius.
Yeah.
Genius feels pretty good for us. But I mean, when we're playing it as the last game in an array of games, we don't have the same dedication as some people. And in fact, one of the articles that introduced me to the culture behind Spelling Bee was one published by the New York Times where it profiles this woman who would wake up at 3 a.m. to play the Spelling Bee because the game is released 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, which
Why so early?
I think it's that's midnight Pacific. So it's just, that's when it's like, the door opens up for the next game. It's officially tomorrow throughout the whole US with the exception of Hawaii. So yeah, with the game being released at 3 a.m., this woman, she wakes up and she tries to finish the whole game. And she usually, I mean, like the people that are working through this game, they can finish it in like under 20 minutes. Like they just cruise through these letters because there's a lot of patterns that show up in multiple days. They look at the words that they might have missed the previous day. The game includes a whole grid that tells you how many words there are, how many start with each letter that's possible.
And that would be the using hints.
Exactly.
So something is telling me that this woman who was waking up at 3 a.m. may be a little bit on the crazy competitive side.
Yeah.
I don't think she's using hints.
Very well could not be using hints, or could be sees the grid and just powers through it all.
So we have one of my dear friends on set today, and she's been doing some research for us because I made a claim earlier on that, I think I know a lot of 5-letter words. Well, we're going to put that to the test. So I have a list in front of me here. And this applies to you as well, honey.
Okay.
Okay. The first 5-letter word, Carmen. C-A-R-O-M. I must admit.
Carum.
Carum. I didn't even read it correctly. You know what I thought it was? A name.
I don't know what that means.
I also don't know what that means.
Or what does that mean? We are
Please hold
phoning
it.
a friend.
Phoning a friend. We're in uncharted territory. The next one is Azure, which Azure.
Yeah, it's a color. And it's
I was
also
going to say I knew it's a color, but I didn't know how to pronounce it.
It's also Microsoft's
It's blue.
cloud computing.
Blue.
Yeah, that's what it's named after. Microsoft Azure.
Carum, in billiards or pool, an occasion when the ball hits 2 other balls one after the other.
Carum
alert.
And just like that, you all have a brand spanking new word to use at your local bar that has a pool table.
Show off with your new word. Aki, I assume Accee.
I don't.
Never heard of that. Bursa.
I don't know it.
Cavil. Cavil.
Oh, it makes me think of like cavalier, but I couldn't tell you what that word means.
Yeah. Oh, I know why we don't know what ackee is. It's a tropical tree that is cultivated for its fruit. They're very silly little fruits.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's That makes sense.
And just like that, you've been introduced to the idea of that these puzzles have words that count and don't count, and it actually does not line up with the dictionary. So if you've ever entered a word into Worldle or the spelling bee and it says this is not a word and you swear on your life it is, and you look it up and you wonder if you're crazy, it's because they need to kind of filter out some of those words.
Because there's too many words.
And so I learned with the spelling bee, and it's great that we actually did this because I almost forgot one of my favorite details, is that the way that the spelling bee is designed every day is that there is a 7-letter word finder, sort of bit of software that they've made, and it will find a 7-letter word with 7 different letters. And then with the way that spelling bee works, for those who aren't familiar, you're given this honeycomb-like arrangement of 7 letters. And in the center, you have a golden letter. And every single word you make has to use that center letter plus some sort of assortment of the outside letters. And it must be at least 4 letters long or longer. And if you use every single letter of the 7, you get what's called a pangram, which is like the most points you can get. It's the golden snitch of the big kahuna. It's the winning lotto ticket, not Jotto ticket. But yeah, so there are people online that will bully the puzzle editor because a word that they swear exists is not included, or vice versa, a word that they swear isn't real is included. And it shows up usually with people that have very specific knowledge about things.
Very niche words.
So
most likely.
like physicists go crazy because there are so many different physics specific words that are used so commonly in that field that it just, your brain thinks that everyone has to know the word because I hear it, 300 times a day. And then they enter the spelling bee and then they're like, oh,
not a word.
I'm in a fringe group in society in some ways.
So it's the editor's job to decide what's a word and what's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm all for that kind of bullying.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it lends itself to good-natured tomfoolery online about the whole game.
I would say not always good-natured. I bet there's some just bad harassment out there.
I bet some stuff has had to be moderated.
It might be very difficult to be a New York Times editor, in all honesty, because I know the guy who does the daily minis, I think Joel Fragilato.
And then there's also, I think, Will Shorts is like the big editor.
And I curse his name daily.
Yeah. Daily. If you, if we ever saw him in public,
it'd be over for the guy.
And
it's probably good that I have no idea what he looks like
exactly.
or where he's from.
It's just a little writing credit, and you're like, right now, we are premiering the Can I Tell You Something investigative piece, the investigators segment. We have our props. We have our magnifying glasses. I have a little pipe prop. You've got a wonderful hat.
There is nothing we can't solve.
Exactly. We will get to the bottom of it one way or another. And what we're getting to the bottom of.
Sorry, I haven't used a magnifying glass in a while, so I had to make sure that still worked.
Yeah, they're kind of fun. I mean, for this being a cheap magnifying glass.
Yeah, it does get the job done.
It does magnify things. But what we're trying to figure out is, who is Steve G?
Who is he?
Who is Steve G?
Even Rue wants to know who Steve G is. With that, I do want to bring out some of my evidence board, if you will. Mm-hmm. And those who are watching might have noticed that our normal just podcast sign is a little different today, has some new artifacts. And that is because Brendan has so kindly gathered evidence for us to truly find out the identity of Steve G. And I thought it would be good to have a little visual to help us through this.
If you want to listen to our program, head over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, or check us out on social media on TikTok and Instagram, and perhaps Threads at Can I Tell You Something Podcast. That is Can I Tell You SMTH Podcast. Thank you.
So here's a brief high level overview of us trying to figure out Steve G. So the Spelling Bee Forum was first created on July 26th, 2021. On the day, April 1st, 2022.
This is our first evidence that we are submitting.
Our first evidence of Steve G.
His first comment was left on April 1st, 2022. So this is getting into the when of Steve G. His origin story, if you will.
Exactly.
Which is great. We have to start somewhere.
And just to really wrap our heads around how prolific this man is, how dominant he is within this forum that is a competitive forum to be at the top of. So, I mean, hats off to Steve G for all of his work, because on April 2nd, just one day after that first comment, he was the first person to solve it and post all of his hints.
And this is what is so captivating about this man. And for those avid spelling bee beers out there, I'm sure that you've heard of him or have at least wondered about the guy, because he has some of the most interesting takes on hints, quite the personality that shines through with him. And I just think it's cool that he's been there pretty much from day one. And he is so dedicated. And I would just like to make it clear that there was someone ahead of him named Klein with a K, also anonymous, would be interested in finding out who Klein is as well. And he usurped Klein.
Yes. And
within hours.
So the forum is dedicated to people chatting about this puzzle, but the thing that usually shows up at the top of these forum posts are the hints
made by non-New York Times people. So we do need to make a distinction. New York Times Spelling Bee has its own set of hints that is very, very boring and sometimes very useless. So it makes sense that the good people of the Spelling Bee world decided to take things into their own hands and make their own forum. And I think it's safe to say that Steve G is the leader of the Spelling Beers.
He is the queen bee.
We all deserve to know who our queen bee is. Is that too much to ask?
I need to know who I'm worshiping at this point.
Exactly. So that's a little background on the who. We know the when. Let's get into the where.
So anyone that's gone through these forum posts will notice that there is a fun little location added to every single comment. And what we know about Steve G, who sometimes goes in these forums under the name just Steve, but Ormond Beach, Florida is the location that shows up.
So I have a map printed out here
that shows not a precise location, because we actually don't want to know his actual address, because that's weird and creepy.
We're not that kind of detectives.
But in terms of a geography, it helps us understand who this man is, because this man now has to wake up at 3 a.m. because this is an East Coast Standard Time operation.
Right. So now we have the who, the when, and the where, and we can start filling in these little assumptions. Like you said, he has to wake up very early to be the first comment.
Exactly.
Which means he would be up with the 3 a.m. woman.
Exactly. If
If not even before, to start prepping. And that now makes me wonder, what's his job? Does he have kids to look after? Is he a plant from the New York Times? Is Steve G even real? Is he a computer?
these are all fantastic questions. And I think that the biggest of all of these questions, too, is why Steve? Because we have the why section.
The why section. And that's what's really going unanswered for me. Because we have a couple little artifacts to present, which isn't much to go off of, right? But the why, what drives Steve G to be so obsessed and enthralled in a good way with the spelling bee? Look, man, I get it. It's a fun game. But it seems as though this is almost his life's work.
It's a magnum opus of sorts, because I don't even think we've talked about that. Usually when people post hints on these forums, it's one set of hints. That's it. This man shows up and presents the great people of the spelling bee world, the Beehive, which is the...
No, they're not the Beehive. The Beehive are Beyonce's fans. Let's not cross-contaminate here.
I think that they refer to themselves as the Beehive, or at least like maybe the Swarm. I got to double check that. I should fact check that before I get the Swarm angry.
I feel like the actual Beehive will slaughter anyone who uses that name.
Yeah,
without
in vain.
In vain.
But Steve G shows up and posts 2 sets of hints every single day. And the hints are his classic long form little, it's almost like a crossword style hint, and then minimalist hints. Right. And the minimalist hints always give me a little hoot because they're one word hints. And I like to think of people having a preference in what Steve G hints they like most.
Are you a regular Steve G or minimalist Steve G?
And sometimes it's fun to compare between the two, because then it's like you got a double hint for a word.
And then that is an extra set of work. So not only is he creating this first body of hints in the early hours of the morning, but now he's doing round 2.
Exactly.
And I do wonder when that started. Because I can't imagine that he was doing minimalist from day one. It seems like he's almost evolving in his craft, growing knowledge to become perhaps senior Steve G. Because first he was Steve, and now he's Steve G. What's next for Steve G?
Who knows?
I do actually want to question some of your evidence here.
Yes.
Because I'm pulling up Spelling Bee on my phone just to, kind of get in the mood with Steve. And I'm seeing here that it says he's from Sound Beach, New York.
Really?
Really.
Has Steve moved? We should double check this.
Maybe he has multiple locations.
Or could be traveling.
Or multiple homes. Which could explain why Steve doesn't work.
And has a lot of time.
To do this.
So I have a Steve G theory. Not in terms of who this person is, but more of a how. And we don't have a how post-it note, but that's okay because I wasn't thinking how.
I guess we should have done who, what, where, when, how. Wait, who? We have who? We don't need what. That's Spelling Bee.
Yeah.
Who, what, where, when, how, and why. We really should have been more thorough detectives the more I think about it.
I mean, this is our first rodeo. Next time it won't be our first rodeo, but
it will be our second.
Exactly. But the how I hadn't even thought about, because I think that this is a grand body of work and it is done with such a rapid pace of execution that there needs to be prep beforehand. You can't just type out all of these clues really, really quickly in the hours of the morning. So here's my theory. A lot of words show up multiple times in the Spelling Bee.
Throughout a week or something.
Throughout a week, throughout the entire course of Spelling Bee. So there is a domain of previous words. Now, what someone like Steve might be doing, potentially, is writing hints for every single word that's appeared. And so when it comes to publishing these lists, you can create a program that you would just throw all the words that are the answers for that day, and you can get a beautifully formatted piece of text to comment that has all of your predefined hints for every single word. If I were Steve G and I was working at 3 a.m. to make this happen, I would be using other resources to get all of these answers. I mean, you have a defined set of letters. There's only so many words that could exist. You figure out what words are in the puzzle. then you submit that word list into your program to generate your comments, and then you post those comments.
So you're really describing a full-blown operation here.
Yeah, and I think that actually makes it, on one hand, some people might say, isn't that less work? Isn't Steve doing less? No, Steve's doing more because he's throwing software at this thing.
That's what makes me think it's a full-time job.
I think that this is maybe a bored software engineer, because if we know one thing about the Worldle cinematic universe is that there are computer science people working to find the best possible solution to everything. And the kind of work that they do would be similar to what Steve G would be capable of. It would not surprise me if we do some behavioral analysis of this person.
The who.
That this is someone that knows how to make computers work for them. So they are leveraging an entirely different bit of knowledge.
I like the theory. I do.
Yes.
But I would like to challenge it with my own.
Do give another theory.
And this isn't backed by anything. It's purely opinion-based, as any good detective starts with.
You have to start with a hunch. Like mine was a hunch.
I'm going with my hunch. And I've shared this with you before. I have always thought that Steve G is a New York Times plant, meaning he is an employee, perhaps a 1099 contractor of New York Times, who is sent to create some hype around the game. Because we know that he started at the origin story, right? So he's been around since day 1, day 2, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since, he's been going strong every single day. I wouldn't be surprised if he's never missed a day.
It would be interesting this is where I didn't want to go too intense before we brainstorm this, because what Steve G doesn't know is I'm a little sleuth too, and I know how to make the little buttons work on the computer too. So I might be doing some more, I would say, quantitative detective work around Steve G and some of these answers to see what theories we can support, whether the answers to certain words remain the same through every forum post, or whether there is some sort of New York Timesiness going on.
That's just something, because I've never thought he's a bot. I do believe that Steve G is a real human being.
And we'll get into the way that Steve G writes in these forums.
We will share some of his comments because
it's amazing.
That's part of, there's just so much lore behind the guy. And I think that's what drove us to really want to figure out who he is, because we just think he's funny. But there's something,
at the end of the day,
there's something about him that feels like he's a plant.
It would make sense.
Because you've said that they haven't done marketing for these games, but we know that marketing is evolved in a different way. And perhaps he is a tool straight from the motherboard themselves.
So let me add some evidence to back that theory too, because great detectives, they work through a bunch of theories to get to some sort of final answer. So I actually have some great evidence to add to what you're saying. In the world of human-computer interaction, meaning in this part of it being like specifically kind of the social media space, we know that the people, or the way that people behave in a comment section, is dependent on what the other comment's tone is. So within certain communities, if you have a very civilized discussion, you're more likely to have additional civilized discussions. But if the community standard is 2-word comments and kind of being brutal to one another, then that's going to be the standard that's established, and people just kind of replicate it. So there is actually, it is what exists that people emulate. And I think that for a group like the New York Times, it'd be very smart to have some sort of plants, because I looked at the first forum posts for the Spelling Bee forum, and some people hated it. They hated the idea of hints being more available, of people being able to get answers more quickly. So it wouldn't surprise me if we really dug through these forums that there was a tone switch that happened at some point, a little bit of social engineering, because, what they want more than anything is for people to discuss the puzzle instead of complaining about a forum. And being able to have two sets of answers or have multiple sets of hints and answers shows you what that community discussion should look like. And I think my theory, based off of what you're saying, I think Steve G showed up hot and the New York Times caught on, and they're supporting this continuous endeavor because it is of such value to that community forum. So essentially they're boosting his posts. Or at least contracting out his writing. Because he is quite the writer. Yeah. So I'd like to get into that to support the who of Steve G. Because if some of you have never played this game, you'll be like, why are you all so obsessed with some rando on the internet? This is why. One of our favorite bits about Steve G, beyond the 2 lists of hints, is the way that he writes through these comment sections. I mean, there are no short comments. A lot of people write little brief things. Steve G has to be working with a full-size keyboard or have the fastest thumbs in the universe. I think that with all due respect to Steve G, he's a writer. This guy he's wise with his words. And so I wanted to give you all a little taste of his mind out there. Steve G creates his hints with 2 letters. So you'll get the starting letter and the one that comes after. And then he will give a number for how many letters are within that word. So one of these a few weeks ago had a CO7. So it starts with CO and it's 7 letters long. And this is what he wrote. Ever since this appeared early this July, every time I go to a Starbucks, I think of ordering one. Maybe that's why I might assume the simple definition suffices. All of our minds were rocked by this new coffee drink, no? I recall catching some flack from Australian coffee snobs, this term seems to be redundant, for comparing it to their flat white. This has steamed milk. Mate? Mate? Not warm milk. And well, I remember pre-Starbucks days, and just getting a cup of joe with milk and lots of sugar from the carts on the street in New York City, and we liked it, in all caps. Anyway, the term has a simple origin as a Spanish word for cut, as in the concept is pure espresso can harsh your mellow, so you need to dilute it with some of that mother's milk stuff. That was one hint for one word. And I do want to also say that that's not how all of these hints are, but there are some words that he will go off on. Right. It's almost like he picks his favorite couple every single day and gives you a story. So for those who are wondering what the word is, I think it's cortado. Yeah, I believe so. Is what he's going off on. And I just loved that because he's great at telling a story. He kind of clues you into his life. He says we a lot, I'm catching. So man's got a family, or at least a significant other. It's just crazy how much you learn from the guy. And I think that, I mean, we keep on going back to why we love Steve G, but it's like, that's the sort of natured comments that we totally gravitate towards. It is the lore. It is this mysterious figure. This is why we brought out the yarn. We have magnifying glasses because we like this so much. In fact, the only reason why we bought all of this detective stuff was first for Steve G. And this has been an episode that we've talked about for a good while. We were kind of trying to figure out how we would make it appealing to the masses. And I hope that we have in some capacity. Because, I mean, I just need to know who this man is at this point. Steve G, if we could find you somehow, if you wish to remain anonymous, that's fine. I want to know that you exist out there and that you are happy and that you are enjoying your cortado or whatever you have it. And also the way that he writes is just so fun. He's just a fun guy. And you don't get that on a lot of forums too online. Just this kind of, this wittiness, I'll tell a little silly story and I'm not going for internet points. This is just what I'm writing about. I feel like it he almost uses the spelling bee as a writing exercise.
I do wonder, and I guess that's really going into the why.
Yeah.
What drives him to do this? Because we have both of the hints, but then I was just looking through the community. He's extremely active and he replies to his comments and really gets into conversation with people. So there has to be some sort of joy that he's getting from this community, which I think a lot of people resonate with online forums. And I wonder if it's like he views it as his little kingdom or something.
I actually, I wouldn't say kingdom. I would say that it's his like little, it's like his bee family. Like there is
his beehive.
His beehive. That's something that shows up in that article talking about the woman that wakes up at 3 a.m. to play this game. There's such a wonderful sense of community that is behind these kinds of games that are more casual by nature, that invite a really broad audience and then have a dedicated few that go above and beyond, like Steve G. I like seeing these games existing out there, because for anyone that's seen online forums for kind of more intense games that people are really passionate about, or TV shows or series, they can get really toxic really quickly. But that doesn't happen in these posts. Besides the first couple where they're like, oh, why'd you make this, New York Times? But now it's just this fun, joyous community. And for people that need the sense of a social outlet around a shared activity that they love doing daily and that feels routine and ritual, I could imagine that this is so fulfilling. It is like, it's one of my favorite things to have seen blossom before my eyes as I dig a bit deeper. And that's what Worldle did as well. I mean, it's a simple game that a lot of people can play, but it brings people together. And I think for me, I really like the idea of making games. And these are the sorts of games that I would say are the most inspirational for me.
I was going to ask you about that because I know that you've talked a lot about some ideas for games, and a lot of times you'll come up with a relatively complicated idea, but then you'll simplify it, or you'll come up with something new and you'll just be like, yep, that one would be way more enjoyable. And I think just like digital games aside, even card games and board games that are easier for people to understand often bring more joy. Because me, with my anxiety, and a lot of people I know, games and game nights can be a really big source of like fear. I think Scrabble is a really great example of that. There's some people who just want to show up to a game and play it and have fun, right? And then there's some people who will show up and take it so seriously and in turn make the others at the table feel incompetent or dumb or lesser than. With an easier barrier to entry, people end up having more fun. And I like games like that a lot more than some really intense games. Not saying the other form of gaming is wrong, but this is a lot more inviting for people. And I think that's really positive to have on the internet.
My greatest joy, though, is seeing how much you gravitated towards these games and how much fun we had playing them together. There are very few games that put people on the same side and have them work through it together, quite like a puzzle. I think that also that's where like escape rooms can be really fun, also very stressful sometimes, usually.
Yeah, but you know what you're getting. If you're going to an escape room, you choose to be there.
You choose to escape. But there aren't that many games that position people both on the same side and have them work together. And I've always been very impressed seeing the power of multiple brains working on the same thing and how much more is possible because of it. Because there were so many times in Crosswords where I don't even know what a certain clue is. And you're like, yep, it's this one. Then you're on to the next. And you're like, oh, it's this one. And
this vice versa.
And
we work together. And I don't think I would have as much fun with these games if I was just doing it alone. But I know that like a lot of people like doing it alone. But for us, working as a team is best.
So the big picture, I think, of all of that is that just because you've made a game doesn't mean it needs to be some sort of competitive sporting environment for everyone. The best games can be played with all different play styles and approaches and sociability with it. And I think the New York Times games are a great example for any aspiring game designers or people that just want to add more games or puzzles into their everyday life or routine. I think that these games are a great example of what these healthy game communities look like. And I really hope that the people listening, whoever you may be, take something like that from this and maybe find a new game that you can play with a friend and or have a new ritual for yourself, even if it's at 3 a.m.
Definitely. And if you haven't played these games before, check them out. They're pretty cool. I know we were kind of late to the hype, but you know, you can pick these up whenever you want. So I would say go out there, go see what Steve G has to say. But also, if any of you know who Steve G is, please, please let us know. I'm just on the edge of my seat.
Yeah, our DMs are open to figure out what's going on, to get to the bottom of it. Because we need to know the truth.
There's nothing I want more.
So that's the episode. We talked about some puzzles that we love. We introduced you all to a household name, Steve G. We added some mystery to the New York Times spelling bee. And we talked about community within games and puzzles. And speaking of community, we want to give a shout out to Camila. Our first positive comment from someone we don't know personally.
Thank you for your support. We were so happy that you liked the podcast. We've been getting some flack.
Yeah.
Recently. So
mostly on TikTok.
Mostly some TikTok flack. So it was great to hear that you liked the show. We hope you and everyone else out there enjoyed this episode. I know it's, we kind of like interacting and getting a little silly with it, but also teaching you something new about the history of these games and the importance they have in our life and in others' lives. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up and we will see you next week for another episode of the Can I Tell You Something podcast.
All right. Bye.
Bye.